You've probably experienced this before. You tell someone good news. You got the job. You finally reach a goal. Something you've been working towards for months actually worked out. And they congratulate you. They smile. They tell you that they're happy for you. But somehow, something feels wrong. You can't quite explain it. There's nothing obvious. They said the right thing. They reacted the way they were supposed to react. But something about the reaction just doesn't feel genuine. Then one day, something goes badly. You lose the job. The relationship ends. You feel that something you really wanted, something you've been working towards, suddenly falls apart. And that same person seems unusually interested. They want to know what happened. They ask questions. They want every detail. And sometimes, there's something almost impossible to notice. A tiny smile, a change in their voice, a little more energy than there should be. Nothing obvious enough to accuse them of anything, but enough to make you wonder, why does this person seem more interested in my failure than my success? Why would someone who claims to care about you feel better when you fail? The answer isn't always hatred. In fact, sometimes it has very little to do with you. It has more to do with how they see themselves. Human beings constantly compare themselves to other people, usually without even realizing it. How successful are we? How attractive are we? How respected are we? How much money do we make? How far ahead are we in life? We don't necessarily sit down and consciously ask ourselves these questions. Our brains make these comparisons automatically. And that can create a problem. Because your success can sometimes make someone else feel unsuccessful. Imagine two friends who started their careers at roughly the same time. For years they're very equal. Similar salaries, similar lifestyles, similar expectations for the future. Neither person feels particularly ahead of the other. Then one of them gets promoted. Suddenly they have a bigger salary, more responsibility, a nicer apartment. Maybe they start traveling more. Their life begins moving in a different direction. The successful friend hasn't necessarily done anything wrong. They haven't insulted the friend. They haven't bragged. They haven't tried to make anyone feel inferior. But the comparison has changed. The other person may suddenly start looking at their own life differently. They may think, why am I still here? Why haven't I achieved that? And what am I doing wrong? And your success has become a reminder of everything they feel they haven't achieved. That feeling can be incredibly uncomfortable. Now imagine the opposite. The person who got promoted suddenly loses their job. The expensive apartment becomes difficult to afford. The successful career suddenly stops looking so successful. And that gap between the two friends becomes smaller again. The person who felt behind may experience something strange. Relief. The friend hasn't necessarily become less successful because they hate them. They might simply feel less inferior. And that's where one of the darkest sides of human psychology comes in. There's a German word for taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. Schadenfreude. It describes that strange feelings of satisfaction when something goes wrong for someone else. And although it sounds cruel, it's actually a surprising human emotion. It can happen when someone feels envy. It can happen when someone feels competitive. And it can happen when another person's success has made them feel bad about themselves. In other words, sometimes your failure doesn't make someone happy because they hate you. It makes them happy because your failure temporarily makes them feel better about themselves. Your success created a comparison. Your failure removes it. And suddenly, they feel normal again. But envy isn't always obvious. When we think about jealousy, we usually imagine someone openly admitting it. I wish I had what you have. But real envy is rarely that straightforward. It can be much quieter. A friend changes the subject when you talk about something you're proud of. Someone immediately explains why your achievement isn't that impressive. You got lucky. Anyone could do that. It's not really that difficult. Maybe you tell someone you got a promotion, and instead of congratulating you, they immediately point out how much more responsibility you will have. You tell them you bought something you wanted for years, and they tell you how much money you wasted. You tell them you're finally getting into great shape, and they tell you that you're becoming obsessed with the gym. None of these comments automatically mean someone is jealous. Sometimes people are just being realistic. Sometimes they're joking. Sometimes they're simply bad at showing excitement. But when the pattern continues, it becomes more interesting. Because then something else happens. When you fail, they suddenly become supportive. They ask what happened. They want to hear the story. They suddenly have plenty of time for you. And maybe they even seem more engaged with you than they were when things were going well. Not necessarily because they want to help you recover, but because the uncomfortable comparison has disappeared. You're no longer ahead of them, you're struggling too. And psychologically, you can feel safer. But there's where things get complicated. This doesn't mean that everyone who enjoys your failure secretly hates you. Human beings aren't that simple. Someone can genuinely care about you and still feel envy. Someone can love you and still compare themselves to you. Someone can want you to succeed while secretly wishing they were the person succeeding. Contradictory emotions can exist at the same time. You can be happy for someone and jealous of them. You can love someone and compete with them. You can want someone to succeed while wishing you were experiencing the same success. That's normal. The important question isn't whether someone has ever felt envy, it's what they do with it. Because feeling something isn't the same as acting on it. You might feel jealous of your friend's new job and still genuinely celebrate with them. You might wish you had someone's relationship and still be happy that they're in love. You might compare your body to someone else and still encourage them when they make progress. That's the difference. The real warning sign isn't over one strange smile, it's a pattern. Pay attention to what happens when things go well for you. Do they celebrate with you? Do they ask questions? Are they genuinely interested? Do they seem happy that you're happy? Or do they immediately find a way to make your success smaller? And then pay attention to what happens when things go badly. Do they help? Do they encourage you? Do they try to make you feel better? Or do they suddenly become fascinated by your failure? Do they want every detail? Do they seem almost energized by your bad news? That's when the pattern becomes meaningful. Because genuine friends don't have to be perfect. They can feel insecure. They can compare themselves to you. They can even be jealous sometimes. But they don't need you to fail in order to feel good about themselves. And there's another uncomfortable part to all of this. Sometimes your success changes relationships even when you haven't changed. You get a better job, you start making more money, you become more confident, you meet new people, you start getting opportunities that you didn't have before. And suddenly, some people behave differently around you. Some become more supportive, others become distant, and some become competitive. Not necessarily because you become arrogant, but because their perception of where they stand compared to you has changed. That's important to understand. People don't only react to who you are, they also react to where they believe they stand relative to you. And that can completely change the relationship. Think about someone you've known for years. Maybe you always felt like equals. You had similar lifestyles, similar problems, similar ambitions. Then one of you starts doing significantly better. Suddenly, the dynamic changes. Conversations can become competitions. Advice can become criticism. Jokes can become insults disguised as humor. And sometimes you don't even realize what's happening until you look back and notice that the relationship felt much easier when neither of you was doing particularly well. That's a difficult realization, because it forced you to ask yourself whether someone actually liked you, or whether they simply liked the version of you that made them feel comfortable. But don't become paranoid. That's probably the worst lesson you could take from this. You don't need to analyze every facial expression. You don't need to assume your friends secretly hate you. And you definitely don't need to start testing people to see how they react when you fail. Instead, pay attention to patterns. Who's genuinely happy when something good happens to you? Who supports you when things go badly? Who can celebrate your success without turning it into a competition? Who will encourage you when you are doing better than them? And who only seems comfortable around you when you're struggling? Those patterns tell you much more than one strange reaction ever could. because someone who genuinely cares about you doesn't need you to be smaller so they can feel bigger. They don't need your failure to feel successful. They don't need your problems to feel important, and they don't need you to lose in order for them to feel like they're winning. Sometimes the most revealing things about a relationship isn't how someone reacts when you succeed, it's how they react when you fall. Because when you fall, they no longer have to look up at you, and what they do next can tell you everything you need to know.